feeling states and they have to be felt. But if you're willing to accept the idea of unconscious memory and unconscious perception, if you're willing to entertain the idea that people might have unconscious motives, why not go whole hog? Why not say, well, maybe people have unconscious emotions as well? Let's look at what some of that evidence might be. One theoretical basis for suggesting that people might have unconscious motives comes from a theory of emotion proposed by Peter Lang, now at the University of Florida, known as the multiple systems theory of emotion. And what Lang argued, Lang was a clinician who did a lot of treatment of phobic patients, and he argued that every emotional state has three components to it. One, which he called the cognitive component, is the subjective experience of emotion. When I see a snake on my desk, I feel fear. Okay? I actually can say, I'm afraid of this. Another is what he called the physiological component, which is kind of a covert somatic response, like my heart starts beating rapidly when I see the snake on my desk. And then there is a behavioral component, which is an overt behavioral response in which I try to move away from the snake. Okay? So you got the feeling state, you got the physiological activation, and you've got the actual behavior. And usually when we think about emotion, we think of those three systems as moving together in the same direction. I feel subjectively afraid of the snake, my heart starts pounding, and I move as far away from the snake as I can get. But Lang observed in his clinical work that you could produce a kind of desynchrony between these various components, so that often after a course of systematic desensitization, patients would say, oh, snake, nice snake, kind of long, isn't it? You just kind of be interested in the snake. But if you measure their heart rate, their hearts are still pounding madly, right? And when you measure it, you say, gee, they never really get that close to the snake. Right? Don't move all the way away anymore, but it doesn't go up and say, nice snake, and pet the snake's head, and things like that. So the person saying, I'm not afraid of the snake, he may not even feel like he's afraid of the snake, but he's still behaving like he's afraid of the snake. That kind of imperfect coupling suggests that there might be unconscious emotion that affects our behavior, even though we're not aware of the emotion. Okay? That's the general idea here. So you've got this multiple systems view. You've got an emotional state and three different components to it. Unconscious emotion would occur when the person doesn't have access to the verbal cognitive component anymore, but still the overt motor component or the covert physiological component are running off as usual. This is what Stanley Rachman calls a state of desynchrony, and for our purposes, it's a particular form of desynchrony in which the person is not consciously aware of an emotional reaction which he's clearly displaying in his physiology and his behavior. Okay, so on the basis of ideas like that, it's possible to entertain the idea of a dissociation between explicit and implicit emotion, where explicit emotion refers to a person's conscious feeling state, but implicit emotion refers to unconscious manifestations of the feeling state that are not correlated with that. So behavior or physiology or whatever. Okay. These days, the literature on unconscious emotion is almost completely dominated by a procedure by the study of attitudes. And there are a number of social psychologists like Tony Greenwald at the University of Washington and Mazarin Banaji at Harvard University who have claimed that people can have attitudes, social attitudes, of which they are unaware, but which nonetheless influence their interpersonal behavior. This idea of implicit attitudes is relevant to the concept of implicit emotion Because attitudes always have an emotional component to them. Every attitude you have is an attitude either in favor of or against something or another. So again, we can have explicit attitudes, which we can define as a person's conscious attitude in favor of or in opposition to some topic, or a person's implicit attitude, which is an attitude that he or she has and which affects his or her behavior, but of which he or she is unaware. Greenwald and Banaji have proposed to assess these implicit unconscious attitudes with a technique which they call the implicit attitude test. And if you're paying any at all attention to the news the last couple of years, you've seen news stories about this. Google and Facebook and other high-tech firms are now using the implicit attitudes test in an effort to make their workplace environments more friendly to minorities and other underrepresented groups by trying to assess not just their workers' conscious attitudes, but also to assess their workers' unconscious attitudes. And here's how it works. The implicit attitude test involves subjects making various kinds of dichotomous judgments. So let's just think there isn't such a thing, but let's just imagine for a second that there's such a version of the implicit attitudes test known as the Swedish-Finnish implicit attitudes test, which is intended to reveal unconscious negative attitudes of Swedes towards Finns or Finns towards Swedes. In phase one, we would present subjects with last names that are either clearly Finnish or clearly Swedish, and there are such names around. It's not like Smith and Jones, right? But Aaltonen, that's a Finnish name. Eriksson, that's a Swedish name, and every Swede and Finn knows this. So in phase one, you're just making this judgment. You're pressing a button, one button if it's Swedish, another button if it's Finnish. Swede, Finn, Finn, Swede, 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 Finn, Finn. That's the way it goes. In the next phase of the experiment, forget Swedish and Finnish names. You're simply presented with a bunch of affectively toned words, and you're asked to judge whether the word represents a good thing or a bad thing. Admiration, that's a good thing. Abuse, that's a bad thing. So again, you got two response keys, good thing, bad thing, good thing, good thing, good thing, bad thing, bad thing, good thing, bad thing. You're just going like that, okay? Then what you do in the implicit attitudes test is you put those two tasks together, okay? So sometimes a Swedish or a Finnish name comes up, and you have to press a key to identify which is which. Sometimes a good or a bad word comes up, and you have to press a key to identify which is which. But in this case, the experiment is arranged so that you use the same key to identify a name as Swedish as you do to identify a word as good. Okay? So Swede and good are on the same key. Finnish and bad are on the same key. Later on, there's another phase in which you reverse that. Swede and bad are on the same key. Finn and good are on the same key. But the general idea behind the implicit association test, it's based on a principle known as stimulus-response compatibility, which is to say that if two tasks share a response, then response is facilitated. It's kind of sort of like priming. It's not exactly priming, but it's like that. But you get faster responses when the response is compatible with the stimulus. The idea here is if you're a Finn who really doesn't like Swedes, okay, then when Swede and good share a response key, you're going to get confused and mixed up, and you're going to respond slowly. But when Swede and bad share a response key, you're going to go like gangbusters, okay? You're going to be able to make those responses really fast. So again, you'll have faster response latencies depending on what your attitudes are towards Swedes or towards Finns. Okay, I put up, distributed to you, and it's up on in the lecture supplements as well, just to be less silly for a second. The IAT, as I'd said before, is often used to assess racial attitudes in various ways, black, white, Anglo, Hispanic, and so on. And you can get there's a paper and pencil version of the so-called race IAT that's intended to assess attitudes about blacks and whites. In any event, it turns out that Greenwald and Banaji have claimed that you can use the pattern of responses on the IAT to reveal negative associations or stereotypes or prejudices, negative attitudes of which the person is not aware. So here, for example, these are white subjects, okay, who are being run here. When they're making judgments about whether a person is black or white, and then making a judgment about whether a word is bad or good. When black is sharing the positive response key, you get longer response latencies, okay, compared to others. So that's the general idea here. And what's interesting is when they ask these subjects, how do you feel? These are white subjects, remember. How do you feel about black people? Their responses showed absolutely no correlation. Very small correlation. Their conscious explicit attitudes were essentially uncorrelated with their unconscious attitudes as revealed by the IAT. Here's another example, Japanese and Korean version of the IAT. There's some historical animosity between Japanese and Koreans, and you can get the same thing here. When Koreans took the IAT, they showed very long response latencies when Japanese were paired with the positive response, and Japanese showed long response latencies when Koreans were paired with the positive response. Again, that's supposed to be an index of people's unconscious attitudes. Greenwald and Banaji refer to this as the blind spot, which is to say that people may think they're not prejudiced, okay, but their scores on the IAT reveal that they are. And the argument is that we all carry around with us these hidden biases based on a lifetime of exposure to various kinds of cultural attitudes and things like that, and that these hidden biases affect our perceptions of various social groups and our behavior towards members of various social groups outside of our conscious awareness and outside of our conscious control. In other words, implicit attitudes as expressions of implicit emotion affect our behavior independent of conscious awareness. Okay. And Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia has now summarized the results of a huge number of these studies. Okay. There's a Canadian-American version of the IAT. Okay. Intended to assess Americans' hidden animus towards Canadians. Here's the African-American, European-American IAT. Here's Asians versus whites, and there are a whole bunch of others down there. And what